Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the Ed Media Conference Committee for inviting me here today. It's an absolute privilege. We've known about Ed Media for many years, and it's wonderful to have had a South African invited. I think we bring perhaps a different perspective. So I'm going to be talking about troubling open education, and I had hoped that this opening image would suggest some sort of turmoil on the waters, but I was told this morning that this is a particularly tranquil part of Vancouver, so imagine that the waves are crashing over these rocks. It is for keynote speakers to provoke, and I think I'll do a little bit of provocation. The slides are up on SlideShare, and I've also put them on Twitter. The link is there. There are quite a lot of references and graphs and images and so on that I will be referring to, and some of them I'll go through quite quickly, so you can find them there. So the talk is going to be in several sections. The first part is about the state of higher education today. Some general comments about higher education, then some comments about open education as a new field of practice, and then some key tensions. And those three key tensions are around the nature of digital, the nature of free, and the nature of legal. And then I'll suggest some responses. So, higher education is often described as being in an age. We hear about the age of austerity. Kurt mentioned that earlier. Certainly something I think many of us here are familiar with. We know about higher education as going through an age of unbundling and financialization as disaggregation happens in teaching and learning in higher education. We certainly know that it's an age of inequality, not only in South Africa but throughout the world. And yet at the same time, in the open education space, we hear about the age of abundance. So, in terms of austerity, public funding for education has been dropping. In developing countries, 2/3 of the most wealthy countries decreased the proportion of public expenditure between 2005 and 2011. And more than half of developed countries reduced spending on education between 2008 and 2012. So public education funding is diminishing, and that's caused some of the austerity. And it's led to this wonderful euphemism called cost sharing, which means passing the costs on to the students. And it's particularly interesting to look at the figures between 2002 and 2012, and the percentage increase of tuition and fees and college textbooks when compared to overall consumer price increases. 89% increase for tuition and fees in this age of cost sharing, 82% increase for textbooks, at a time when overall consumer prices rose by 28%, and in fact house prices dropped. To look even more specifically at what cost sharing means, here are two books. These are 2009 figures: The Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela and the Oxford English Dictionary. So the actual cost in South Africa in 2009 for Long Walk to Freedom was $24.30, and in the USA it was $12.10. If one projected the cost in the USA at the South African proportion of income, that would have been $259. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, in South Africa that was costed at $47, and the USA was at $21.50. As a proportion of income, that would have been $504. Contexts make a very big difference, and open education matters more in some contexts than others, perhaps. We know that higher education has become massified. This is a commonplace. So global tertiary enrollment of 5% per year in the last 2 decades. And we know from our own experiences that non-traditional students have now become the norm. The notion of a typical traditional student straight out of school, etc., is no longer who most of us are teaching. And of course, pervasive inequality throughout the world, and certainly manifest in higher education and in universities. This is acknowledged by the World Economic Forum, for example, who said that one of the top 10 trends of 2014 were widening income disparities. It's actually really shocking. The 62 richest people are as wealthy as half the world. That's fewer people than are sitting in this room with the wealth of half the world. I had imagined that Canada, where we are now, would be one of the countries with a particularly comparatively good Gini coefficient. But interestingly enough, although the US and the UK certainly have a worse Gini coefficient, you know that the closer to 0 a Gini coefficient is, the more equal a society is. In fact, Canada has a worse Gini coefficient than Ireland, Slovak Republic, Slovenia, and Canada had a fine history. So in the 1980s, the Gini coefficient was very low. This graph shows both the percentage of income of the 0.1% income share of the top percentage of the population and the Gini coefficient until now. And it has become dramatically worse. Even in Canada, which was not my image, in fact, when I was looking for this information. But inequality is not just about numbers and differences between rich and poor. In technology, inequality used to be about devices. Now, of course, we know that mobile devices are ubiquitous. Computers are not yet, and broadband is not yet ubiquitous, but mobile devices are pretty ubiquitous to the point that they seem to be the future of technology, and we're very hopeful about that. But it's no longer about the device. It's about the affordability of the data. And there's some incredibly interesting statistics in this report where calculations are actually done on affordability, and affordability in terms of amounts of data needed for particular things, so for email, for MOOCs, etc. And the percentage of the population who can afford mobile internet access in developed countries is 96% of the population. And in, sorry, that's a typo, in developing countries, it's 21%. So it puts a different angle on the notion of overcoming inequality through technology. In all of this, where's knowledge? That's our business, isn't it? Knowledge is becoming increasingly privatized and enclosed. And through that enclosure movement, we're seeing increased intellectual property rights, privatization, commodification, corporatization, globalization, lack of transparency, lack of privacy, and general disempowerment, leading to what has become known as the McDonaldization of education, which is a kind of homogenized version of global North knowledge throughout the world, or a term I encountered, which I think is also very powerful, is the Coca-colonization of knowledge. A professor who's been looking at the changes in higher education argues that universities are moving beyond commodification and privatization to what she calls financialization. And the argument here is that what matters now to universities is the future value. So being dependent on speculation about ability to attract future investors, which is why branding and ratings have become so crucial in universities today. And ratings are literally starting to govern universities by shaping practices at every level. And so we are seeing shareholder capitalism transforming both who and what governs the university, as well as what it's for. And this has a lot of consequences, particularly deterring engagement with public problems and deterring developing and disseminating worldly knowledge. And of course, through all of this, technology is a cause, a consequence, and a mediator of change in higher education. Which means that universities are reimagining themselves, and I feel sure that every one of us in this room has a story of the strategic processes that our universities are going through as we reconsider our roles in this globalized and changing higher education environment. Which brings me to open education, because it would seem that open education brings together a set of values about access and public good, assumptions about shareable knowledge, and assumptions about enabling technology that make a lot of sense, bearing in mind that I'm talking particularly from an educator's perspective, from the perspective of someone whose life's work is teaching and learning. And we're all familiar with that original declaration, the Budapest Open Access Initiative, the first time that the statement was made, an old tradition and a new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. The Cape Town Open Education Declaration, which speaks specifically to open education resources, speaks about being on the cusp of a global revolution where educators worldwide are developing a vast pool of resources, open and free for all, which combines with an established tradition of sharing good ideas with fellow educators and the collaborative, interactive culture of the internet. And this Open Education Declaration will be 10 years old next year. What's happened in the last 10 years? Open education, it would seem, would be a coherent response to the troubles faced in higher education. So is it? There's an expression in South Africa which is ja nee, which means, as my fellow South Africans will tell you, yes, no. So is open education a coherent response? Yes, no. First of all, open education is a nascent, emergent, heterogeneous field of practice. It's only a decade old. And it's varied and multidimensional. When you talk about open education, you're talking about open education resources, which a lot of what I'll be talking about today is focused on. But you're also talking about open education practices, open licensing, and open scholarship in general. And of course, there's open data, open research, open science, the open web, open knowledge, and they both intersect and diverge quite substantially. There are, in fact, quite different ecosystems for the different types of openness, and it can be quite confusing for educators. As I mentioned, it's a nascent field of practice and a nascent field of research. So one of the projects based at the center that I run, the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching at the University of Cape Town, keeps an open bibliography on open education resources for development, which you're welcome to have a look at. It has about 600 references at the moment, trying to keep track of this emergent field of research. And this particular project is looking at open education resources from the perspective of the Global South, because most of the research that's been done to date in this area is in the Global North, and we all know that context makes all the difference. Another aspect that adds to the complexity is that open education exists in degrees. It's not possible to have a binary view of open education. It's not, it is open or it's not open. It exists on degrees of social openness, technical openness, license openness, and financial openness. And so even trying to define a particular resource or a particular practice needs a more nuanced description. And it always occurs in historical cultural contexts. This is an example of an OER MOOC research project we're involved with at the moment. We're producing 12 MOOCs at the University of Cape Town, and we made the decision that our default would be that the MOOCs would be open and that the resources would be open education resources, which is actually remarkably challenging, although that might seem counterintuitive. And very importantly, open education occurs in unequal contexts. And here I'm referring to valuable work that is being done, particularly through open science research networks, who point to the importantness, the value of recognizing situated openness and considering how open and shared knowledge practices can democratize knowledge, while also recognizing how such notions are embedded within colonial histories that explicitly deployed openness as a way to legitimate the taking of individual people's knowledge. And so a situated open approach to research and education needs to develop practices in response to these kinds of hierarchies of power and ensure that simultaneous modes of being open and closed and sharing and restrictive can coexist to manage those inequalities of power and power relations. So open education sounds simple, but it's not reducible to a simple definition because it's a complex assemblage of social, political, and technological elements developed over time. It's really complex. It's always relational. It always exists in relation to closure, on a continuum, is permeable, is not always positive. In fact, it has a shadow side. And it's not intrinsically afforded by technology. Which brings me to the three key tensions I would like to mention. The first tension in open education is the nature of the digital, referring back to my point about affordances. The second is different understandings of what free means. And the last is the legal underpinnings. So, attention about the nature of the digital. We hear that it's the age of abundance, the end of content scarcity as digital distribution achieves ubiquity. We know that the cost of the digital product, we know that digital goods have a marginal cost that approaches zero. Making digital copies, whether 10 or 10,000, is essentially costless and exhibits no degradation. And we have seen the explosion of user-generated content. The last figures I managed to find are from 2014, 300 hours of video content uploaded to YouTube every minute. This is extraordinary. This is the reference to the age of abundance, content online and abundant. And we now measure these bits and bytes in zettabytes and exabytes and things I'd actually never heard of before. And so we assume that digital is open. Digital equals open. But digital affords open, and it also affords closed. Analog has affordances that can be more open than digital. The obvious example is libraries. A library buys a book and lends that one book, which it's paid for once, out to as many people as possible until the book falls apart. Of course, with e-books and digital books, the library buys access with a certain number of users attached to that access. So, in fact, loses control. And analog then, in that case, is more open than digital. And what the digital does is it moves resources and teaching materials from products to services, a profound difference. From tangible to intangible, from ownership to license. You no longer own the material, you have the right to use the material. You have a license to use the material. And of course, what the digital does is it introduces digital rights management, which is the practice of imposing technological restrictions that control what users can do with the media, which is much more closed than analog, which you can do what you like with your book. My favorite example of this is when Amazon erased 1984 from Kindles throughout the world. Of all books to be erased on copyright grounds, 1984 was the one. And users discovered that they thought they'd bought the book, but they hadn't. They didn't even own the file on their own Kindles. And Amazon removed them all and said, they're terribly sorry, but the company didn't have the rights to sell it. So what we're seeing is new ecologies of access. We've always had legal and illegal, and we've always had analog, and now we have digital. And the ecologies of access are shifting into a different space. The legal digital space is that of open content in open education, and the digital illegal space is pirate sites and file sharing. George made a wonderful comment yesterday. He quoted somebody who spoke about researchers need to research the state of the actual, not the state of the art. And so when we look at ecologies of access, it's really important to look at the state of the actual. Which brings me to different understandings of free. What does it mean, free? What does it mean when the UNESCO COL definition of open education resources are materials and resources that are offered freely, that are openly available to anyone? What do people understand that to mean? The first important point is that the notion of the public domain is increasingly understood as publicly available. In common parlance, even by academics and educators, when people say, well, it's in the public domain, they mean it can be shared, I can quote it, it's available. But in fact, legally speaking, the public domain is that which is not in copyright, either because the copyright has expired, or because the creator made an intentional decision not to put the work out of in the public domain, or because it's not covered by copyright. So ideas are not covered by copyright, titles are not covered by copyright. That's what the public domain strictly means. So if you say that something's in the public domain, it is publicly available. But being publicly available doesn't automatically mean it's in the public domain. So free in open education strictly means that the creator or author has kept copyright ownership and provided permissions up front, or that the resources are in the public domain. That's what it legally means. But that's not what it's understood to mean. Online is generally understood to be free. And we're seeing the rise of new cultural practices. Bearing in mind that we research the actual, we are seeing piracy cultures all over the world. This is Castells, one of the top sociologists in the world, saying, we are witnessing a growing number of people building media relationships outside institutional sets of rules. And we're seeing the rise of an effective economy. File sharing has emerged as one of the most popular dimensions of a new effective economy in which it simply feels good to share. And then, even better, to embellish, remix, and share again. As Castell says, a very significant proportion of the population is building its mediation through alternative channels of obtaining content. Piracy cultures have become part of our everyday life in the network society, sometimes even without us fully acknowledge them as such. The pirates are more often than not all of us. I won't ask people to put up their hands and ask where you have downloaded what from, because it is all of us. And we're seeing the quiet encroachment of the informal. The blurring of boundaries and the breaking of rules is the norm everywhere. Everywhere, not just in developing countries. So in the Netherlands, only 10% of all e-books on devices were found to be paid for. In the UK, up to 76% of popular textbooks are available as free pirated e-books. In Russia, 92% of e-book readers obtained books by illegally downloading. And one that you might be particularly familiar with in academia is Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub being the site that was started by a Russian academic, which makes available research articles, academic research articles that are normally behind paywalls, and which are downloaded by people and academics all over the world. North America is the 5th biggest grouping of downloaders. The data from Sci-Hub shows that most of these are from sites in urban centers near universities. This is a global phenomenon. A survey that was done on Science after the story ran that with the image I just showed, ran a survey with 11,000 respondents about Sci-Hub. The respondents were all ages, all disciplines. 60% of them had used Sci-Hub, so that must have skewed the sample. They were from developed and developing countries, but 85% said it is not wrong to download scholarly articles. That's the culture and the belief system that exists. And the reasons for using it were that 50% of respondents said lack of journal access. And of course, this goes back to the starting point about the age of austerity, as journals and journal subscriptions are being cut by libraries throughout the world, including Harvard, not just the so-called poorer universities. For many, it was simple convenience. For some, and interestingly, about a quarter of respondents said that they objected to the profits that publishers made. That was why they used it. Peter Suber from Harvard University says, I don't endorse illegal tactics, however, a lawsuit, and of course there are lawsuits against Sci-Hub, isn't going to stop it, nor is there any obvious technical means. Everyone should be thinking about the fact that this is here to stay. Research done by the Research in Open Education Resources project, which I mentioned, which runs from my university across numerous countries across the global south, has done research with teachers across 12 countries and found that many teachers assume all digital resources are open education resources. They're very happy to share, and they don't understand the terms of licensing. And certainly open education resources are not understood in terms of the terms typically used in the literature. A much smaller case study, which I undertook at a South African university through surveys and focus groups, about 1,000 students and 6 focus groups, found that students didn't know the difference between legal and illegal resources. We actually asked them to list legal and illegal resources and then categorize them. And they were muddled. They would put Wikipedia as an illegal resource and something else as a legal one. They were very clear that they had a right to educational and scholarly resources, but they interestingly distinguished between attribution and copyright. So just to give the voices to the students, they asked, this is from the focus groups, is it unethical to want to be educated? Or is it unethical to charge so much? One of them, and this was a law student, because we spoke to law students, health sciences students, and media studies students. Even though in my head I know it's illegal, I know it's wrong, it's just a technical thing. Substantively speaking, it's the right thing to do. And it just seems morally, if anything, we should have that stuff available. But as I mentioned, they differentiated quite clearly between attribution and copyright. So plagiarism in student heads is a no-no. With plagiarism, you're lying. But copying a textbook, you're not harming anyone. It's your education. With plagiarism, it's like, this is mine, it's claiming it's your own, and that's why it's scarier. And finally, these resources and tools being so expensive makes it only accessible to a certain group of people. Everything should be open. There are extraordinary quotes from the students and what they said. Of course, we had to assure them that the interviews were anonymous, so I can't tell you exactly who said them other than they were in the focus groups and they came from those disciplines, and they were mostly first-year students. Which brings me to the last key tension I would like to draw your attention to, and that is the legal underpinnings. The elephant in the room. I'm afraid we need to talk about copyright. This is the moment at which I lose you, I'm sure. This is the moment you think, this is not what I came for. I'm an educator. This is really boring. And when they talk to me about this in my university and the librarians talk to me about this, I stop listening. But please, listen. It's really important. We're familiar with the discourses around copyright. Criminality and commodity. The notion that knowledge is somehow like a car, which it clearly is not. But there is a very powerful set of discourses that are attached to the way copyright is spoken about. But copyright's always been regarded as a necessary evil. The idea has always been that it should be for a period as short as possible, that it should benefit the producer, the creator, the writer, not the intermediary. And there's always been this important balancing that has to happen between creator rights and user rights. So in 1841, in the House of Commons, copyright was acknowledged as a monopoly. And a monopoly is evil, but for the sake of the good, we must submit to the evil. The evil ought not to last a day longer than is necessary for the purpose of securing the good. This was understood by Fox Films, Hollywood, in 1932. Creative work is to be encouraged and rewarded, but private motivation must always ultimately serve the cause of promoting broad public availability. The ultimate aim is to stimulate artistic creativity for the general public good. The sole interest of the United States in conferring the monopoly lies in the general benefit derived by the public from the labor of authors. And so copyright has always been premised on the notion that knowledge should be free. Right from 1774. Science and learning are in their nature, publici juris, and they ought to be as free and general as air and water. In a word, I have no difficulty to maintain that a perpetual monopoly of books would prove more destructive to learning and even to authors than a second eruption of Goths and Vandals. And of course, we know that knowledge is premised on a notion of accretion. Newton is the one who's supposed to have said that knowledge creation is about standing on the shoulders of giants. And Goethe was one of the first to talk about knowledge being formed by previous knowledge. What am I then? Everything that I've seen, heard, and observed, I've collected and exploited. My works have been nourished by countless different individuals, by innocent and wise ones, people of intelligence and dunces. I have reaped what others have sowed. My work is the work of a collective being that bears the name of Goethe. So, to go back to the notion of the public domain is not an unintended byproduct or graveyard of copyright works, but its very goal. Lawrence Liang, who is a prominent lawyer in India, writes extensively on these issues. If you would like to read more about it, I recommend his work highly. And he says, initially the practices of people operated on the presumption that everything was in the public domain, except where otherwise stated. And copyright didn't play much of a role. The history of copyright has centered on a reversal of this presumption, to the extent that everything is assumed to be protected, unless specifically stated to be in the public domain. So we've seen this extraordinary shift. And the fight for the public domain is current. My favorite example being the Happy Birthday song, which until last year, one had to pay to use, even though it was originally written by two sisters and published in their book, Song Stories for the Kindergarten, in 1983. And Warner has been earning $2 million a year in royalties, until last year when Warner's copyright claim was declared invalid. And the song is effectively now in the public domain, so you'll be happy to know that you can use it in your video, put up your children's birthday video on YouTube without paying any royalties to Warner. But as I mentioned, we're in the vice grip of commerce. We're in the midst of an enclosure movement in our information environment. And so information that used to be free is increasingly being privatized. And this enclosure is caused by the conflicts and contradictions between intellectual property laws and the expanded capacities of new technologies. The exact opposite of the Budapest Open Declaration, in fact. And what we are facing at present is an existing copyright regime that underpins open education and is under serious pressure. And please bear with me a little while longer in terms of copyright, because IP issues that affect educators occur in strange places. I don't know how many people in this room have been following the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what has been described as one of the most ambitious free trade agreements ever signed. It's an agreement that has been negotiated for many years in secret between 12 Pacific Rim countries. And when you look at that list, you'll see that some of them are very much developed countries and some of them are very much developing countries. It was ratified, it was signed by all 12 countries at the beginning of this year. And those 12 countries have got 2 years to take it back to their governments for that agreement to be ratified. It's a free trade agreement. And it will enter into force after ratification if this occurs within 2 years. And if the ratification is not in place by all before February 2018, it will enter into force after ratification by at least 6 states, which together have a GDP of more than 85% of all the signatories. In other words, it doesn't really matter whether the developing countries in that group have this agreement ratified by their own governments and their own people. Why am I mentioning all this? Well, it has immediate concerns for education, and particularly for education in developing countries, because the agreement exports some of the worst aspects of US copyright law without many of the balancing benefits. It locks developing countries into policies that hurt local creativity, restrict access to knowledge, and slow innovation. And it also threatens to lock US law and policy into a regime designed for the 20th century. So it's bad for the US too. The Creative Commons organization has written extensively about the dangers of this for copyright in particular. So the first thing that is of particular concern is that the 20-year copyright term extension being argued for. So at the moment, it's generally a lifetime plus 50 years before the public domain. This trade agreement wants a lifetime plus 70 years. That's an entire generation of school children who will not have access to materials that are not in the public domain. The analysts from Creative Commons have pointed out that the mention of the public domain is lip service at best. So the text that supported the public domain explicitly has been removed as a policy objective. And it also notes that enforcement provisions are mandatory, while exceptions and limitations are optional. So exception limitations are obviously those aspects which refer to education, fair use, disability, and so on. They become optional, but enforcement becomes mandatory. And we are seeing potentially drastic infringement penalties, even for non-commercial sharing. Excessive monetary fines for lesser infringements. Criminal penalties for circumventing digital rights, even if there was no copyright infringement on underlying content through digital rights management. These are incredibly heavy-handed approaches to the kinds of practices that we have seen to be normalized in society. And frighteningly, investor-state dispute settlements that may be leveraged would be subject to the dispute settlements, meaning that a private company could bring a lawsuit against a country, if that country adopts a law that the company claims would harm its right to exploit copyright interest. Which means that the role and requirements of private companies are foregrounded and are more dominant than those of individuals, institutions, and countries. We're talking about big business setting the terms. This isn't the producers and the users. This is the intermediaries. What does this mean for education? What does education need? And what do developing countries need? Well, copyright itself needs rethinking. Clearly, the intentions of those original copyright laws have gone way beyond what's actually been enabled and let loose through new technologies. And indeed, the intellectual property frameworks which shape higher education, higher education engagement are anachronistic, they're outdated, they're out of sync with the urgent needs of a digitally mediated world and an extremely unequal world. And it really matters. It really matters in education. It has profound implication. It's essential that institutions and educators become aware. At the moment, do you know whether you own your own copyright on your teaching resources? Do you know what you signed when you took that job description, when you signed the contract? Did you read the clause? Is it you or is it your institution? Most educators don't know. They're so happy to have a job, they simply sign. And of course, we know that for research, well, we hand it over, don't we? We sign away our copyright. We don't need to, but we do. And really, educators and academics need to be taking control. Which brings me to the last section, some responses. What do we need to do? In general and in specific. We've got to reclaim education as a common good in the face of this privatization and this financialization. And I was very pleased to read a recent UNESCO report that is actually talking about this pendulum that has swung too far and argues for rethinking education as a common good. We've got to reclaim knowledge as a public good bearing in mind that a public good is non-rivalrous and whose use by one person doesn't compete with another person and does not exclude other persons from its use. Knowledge is not a commodity. And we've got to reclaim the commons. There's a lovely poem about the commons. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from off the goose. Well, I know we're not geese, but I think it makes a powerful point. And we are talking about the digital knowledge commons, not the natural resource commons. And they're not the same. The digital knowledge commons is generative and regenerative. It's based on peer production. It's non-rivalrous. It's about open access as a good. It's physical and intangible. And there is actually a threat of underuse. So in terms of education, the value of the commons for education is that knowledge producers and resource creators are in charge. It has ethical and social benefits, and it shifts the notion from a knowledge economy for some to a knowledge society for all. What do we do? What is to be done? Here are some specific suggestions, because this is not something that I feel that educators can be neutral about. What can we do? What can be done? Well, the state can support the Paris Declaration on open education. Do you know whether your country has signed the Paris Declaration that argues that all resources that use public monies for teaching should be made freely available, should invest in the knowledge common, should steer the market through light touch interventions and incentives, and should protect the development needs of the country? If you look at what's going on in India, for example, where they have very good copyright provisions and are under massive pressure from big multinationals to change those development-oriented copyright laws. As universities, we must make sure that our universities assert the academics and authors as the agents and the owners of their own resources and knowledge produced. Universities need somehow, in this very difficult world we live in, to protect the autonomous university at the heart of a commons-based structure, to develop and support collaborative initiatives in knowledge dissemination, which is much of what open education is about, and to update institutional policies. If you look at those institutional policies, they are remarkably out of date. Many of them don't even mention the possibility of Creative Commons licenses, which are forms of copyright. And then lastly, but certainly not least, there's us, the educators. And the first thing is read the fine print. We sign away without thinking what we're doing. We can hold on to our copyright. We can negotiate Creative Commons licenses. Certainly with our own work with MOOCs, we are working with multiple MOOC platforms. We renegotiated the contracts that were sent to us to include Creative Commons licenses. It can be done. If they CC BY, those who want to commercialize can do. But we have to make that decision to do so. So we have to engage in copyright debates as educators. We should be participating in open ecologies of many kinds and experimenting with open models. There are lots of things that we can do. That's not the real purpose of the talk. It's rather to end on a more positive note, because so many of these broad trends are quite dismal and quite frightening. And I fear that they happen without our knowledge and behind our backs. So let's reclaim open education as a means to an end, not an end in itself, as one strategy for an equitable, democratic, and peaceful world. Thank you.